interested in this, and I suppose what I'm talking about today partly are some of the ideas and myths of the First World War. One of the great myths we can look to is the idea that Unionists enlist in the 36th Ulster Division and then all disappear off to France and are largely killed in the Battle of the Somme, while Republicans, Nationalists, rebel in Dublin in Easter 1916 to be put down by British, by which we mean English troops. So that's sort of one of the great myths, I suppose. But of course that's to very much oversimplify the relationship between Ireland and the British Army and what the nature of the British Army in Ireland actually is at the time of the Easter Rebellion. If we think of this poster here, quite an important one. Mike has spoken in some detail about the Irish volunteer movement, about 180,000 strong in the summer of 1914. That splits then in September 1914, provides the basis of the Irish volunteers. It's a much smaller movement, 10, 11, 12,000 strong, but also that much larger Irish National Volunteer movement. And it's the Irish National Volunteers that John Redmond, the Irish Parliamentary Party leader, is here appealing to enlist in the British Army. Terribly unmilitary figure, John Redmond had never served in the army himself, even in a sort of school or university cadet corps, as so many Edwardian MPs had, and also particularly ill-served in this poster by the artist, who seems to be incapable of getting the arm right, so we end up with a Kitchener pose with a very strange illustration indeed. But of those sort of 180,000 members of the Irish volunteer movement in the summer of 1914, the British government estimated that about 32,000 ended up serving in the British Army during the First World War, particularly associated with the 16th Irish Division, which takes very heavy casualties in the Battle of the Somme, at Gilmore and Ginchy battles in September 1916, but actually in Easter week 1916 takes heavy casualties at Hulluch against the German gas attack, and indeed more Irish soldiers are killed in the Hulluch attack in France than are killed by the rebels in the Easter Rising itself. So that sort of gives us some ideas of some of the perspectives there. In the Easter Rising itself then, we do actually have the basis of a civil war of sorts, and that when the Rising breaks out, it's units of the Irish regiments that are in Dublin at the time that contain the initial Rising and do a lot to put the Rising down over the next 6 days. Sizable reinforcements start to arrive from England in Easter Tuesday and into the Wednesday. They're deployed into Dublin, but in that early period, a lot of the defence of Dublin, the containing of the Rising, falls very much to the Irish regiments. And the late Keith Jeffrey put it very well when he said that if you want to understand modern Irish history, you don't have to understand why Ulster Unionists go and fight in the Somme and why Irish Republicans rebel in Dublin. You have to understand why it's men of the 3rd Royal Irish Regiment that do a lot to contain the rebellion in Dublin and to put that down. And another slide I'll come to, amongst the many things that went on to commemorate the Easter Rising on Easter Sunday, a number of days ago, there was an event held in Grelby, County Down, which was organised by the local branch of the Royal British Legion and is based around this grave, which is to Sandy McClelland, who was a soldier in the 4th Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles, recruited from North Down. And this is a memorial to him by his father. The father's then buried in the grave with the 2 young sons and with his wife. As far as I can work out, this is a memorial to the son rather than the son being buried there, but I need to check that out with Commonwealth War Graves, who have only recently opened up their archive and all of this. This was an event that was organised by the Royal British Legion, attended by, amongst others, Mike Nesbitt, leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, and that provided a focus for the British soldiers who were killed in the Easter Rising. And it's thought that it's 116 British soldiers who were killed in the Rising. The overall figures, which I think I've cribbed from Mike's book, are something like 132 members of the Crown Forces, so that's policemen, Royal Irish Constabulary, Dublin Metropolitan Police, as well as British Army, 64 rebels and 230 civilians. So you're worth thinking about that civilian casualty rate, which is actually larger than the other 2 groups put together. If we turn then to what exactly was the British Army in Ireland like in 1916, well, most of the units in Ireland by the time of the Rising are reserve units of the Irish regiments. By that we mean units like the 3rd Royal Irish Regiment and 3rd Royal Irish Rifles, which were in Dublin when the Rising itself broke out. And they were units which had existed before the war as basically part-time units, as amateur military units. They had been formed under the Hamilton reforms in 1908 as what was called the Special Reserve, but they could trace their origins back to the old militia regiments that went back to 1793. So very local affiliations. So the 3rd Royal Irish Rifles was the old County Antrim militia, and then had gone into Special Reserve with that title. So the role of these units in Ireland in 1916 was basically to raise recruits, to train them up, and then to post them out to units at the front, out in, particularly in France. And that then meant that these units were a very fluctuating nature. A lot of them end up, by the time of the Rising, being very under strength. A lot of them had sent out very significant drafts early on in 1916, so none of these units seems to be more than 450 strong when the Rising breaks out. This at a time when a standard British infantry battalion would have had around 1,100 men in it before any casualties, so that gives you an idea how under strength this all was. The sort of amateur basis of these units persisted to some degree in that a number of the men that you had in the ranks, and certainly a number of the officers, were what we could think of as the old and the bold, as the term is sometimes used about elements of the territorial army today. And these were men who had been long-serving officers or other ranks in these units when they were organised as part-time units. In peacetime, the Special Reserve units relied on men who enlisted for a 4-month period of initial training and then returned for 3-week camps each year as basically refresher courses. Otherwise, they carried out normal jobs, normal occupations, largely agricultural labourers, unskilled town labourers were the groups that particularly could work that round their day-to-day employment. But also, well, Butler's important work on this, due to be published, and shows that the shipyards in Belfast had made special provision in peacetime for their men to be involved in these amateur units. So there is a sort of skilled working class element involved in this in peacetime as well. So there's an element of that still there, particularly sort of long-serving non-commissioned officers who were thought to be rather too old to go out to the front, but were seen as good as training new recruits. They are still with these units when war breaks out. There's also a number of men who are in these units because they've been wounded serving at the front. And that's an important contingent, because a number of these men had been wounded at the front, had been in hospital, were deemed to have been more or less recovered from their wounds, but are then posted to these reserve battalions until they're seen to be fully fit for service back at the front. And that of course brings very useful experience to these battalions. This brings experience of modern fighting methods, and a number, particularly of the non-commissioned officers who have served at the front, proved to be very effective leaders in the chaos of the rebellion. And of course leads to a very ugly situation to do with Captain Bowman Coulthurst that we've already heard a little bit about, and the atrocities that he carries out that I'll say more about later on, and that because he was a regular officer and had been wounded on the retreat from Mons, a lot of what are meant to be senior officers to him actually defer to him because of his military experience, and don't actually rein him in and prevent him carrying out the atrocities as it's clear that he's going to. We also end up with some other rather odd contingents involved in these reserve units. When the war broke out, the Royal Irish Constabulary, which of course was a paramilitary police force before the war, was asked to provide 50 inspectors who would then be directly commissioned as captains into the British Army. A number of those men ended up serving with the new armies, 10th Division in particular, but a number are then held back in these reserve units. They're seen as being particularly good trainers of men, and it's thought that they're important at that level. So Major William Leatham, for example, the 3rd Royal Irish Rifles, had been a musketry instructor with the Royal Irish Constabulary in Dublin for 3 years before the outbreak of war. Then understandably it seemed that he'd be particularly good in instructing them in the use of rifles in the army. So we have various groups, various levels of experience, and we also have some very, very raw recruits involved in these units, men who had just been recruited and were being trained to be sent out to France. So Lieutenant A.M. Jameson of the 5th Leinster Regiment, which is at the Curragh, when the rising breaks out and is in action in Dublin by late on Easter Monday, he noted in a letter back to his family, "You'll hardly believe it, but of myself and 10 men in A Company, only 3 of us could shoot at all. Most of the others were newly joined recruits and had never fired a shot. So my time was taken up with potting," by which he means that he was carrying out sniping activity himself, which as an officer wasn't really what he thought he should have been doing. He should have been directing his own men, but because so few of them had actually used a rifle, that was a real problem. So the Special Reserve units are a very odd mix. They're a mix of inexperience and experience, a lot from the old amateur units from before the war, and a number of officers who were there because, to be quite blunt, they were deemed to be too old and or too silly to command units in active service. So there's quite an ugly mix here in some ways, and not particularly well prepared defence force in many ways. There are a number of other British military units that are in Dublin when the rising breaks out. I'll just mention a few of them. The 10th Royal Dublin Fusiliers was the last of the new army units that was being formed in Ireland. It has a very strange career, and it ends up going out to serve with the 63rd Royal Naval Division before it's transferred to the 16th Irish Division. Then only after there had been a lot of complaints by John Redmond, who said that there was a Belfast brigade in the Ulster Division, so why was there not a Dublin brigade in the 16th Division? And that seems to account for the 10th Royal Dublin Fusiliers move. But they were designed as a commercial battalion, so they're tying in with this idea that you may have heard of PALS units in Britain. So the idea there was that men who were sort of skilled working class, lower middle class would enlist together and serve together, particularly aimed at clerks, at civil servants, at students, at those sorts of groups in Dublin. So it was a unit that was still essentially forming and training in Dublin when the Rising broke out, and is very, very raw in terms of its military experience. Other groups are, in some ways, even more bizarre. The University of Dublin had an officer training corps, Trinity College Dublin, based there. And the officer training corps had been formed at the time of the Hall reforms, actually quite late on, 1912, for Trinity's officer training corps. And the idea was that in peacetime, men who were doing their degrees at Trinity could then qualify to become officers in either these special reserve units or indeed in the regular army by doing some training with the officer training corps. Mostly it was one evening's training a week, a few weekends a year, and an annual camp of about 2 weeks. By the outbreak of the First World War, none of these university officer training units were really providing that much for the army, with a very good account about the one in Belfast here at Queen's University, where it's inspected in 1912 by General Sir Neville Littleton, who was then the General Officer Commanding in Ireland. And he inspected the OTC and said that it was very well turned out. They were very trained, marched well, the shooting competitions had all gone perfectly well. But this was really a terrible waste of time, because practically all the students that were involved in the OTC were medical students and were going to go on to be medical doctors, not to go into the army in any capacity. So on that basis it was all really a bit of a distraction. And that was the view in a lot of the OTC units in England as well. If you look at the numbers going in from University of London, Birmingham, anything like that, into the army pre-war, it's very small, because pre-war a British Army officer still needed to have a private income, even in a sort of bog standard English county regiment, of something like £100–150 a year, which in today's money we're probably looking at something like £10–12,000 as a private income to provide money for uniforms, to provide money for horses, to pay mess bills, essentially the sort of meal bills within the army. So that meant that a lot of those that were training for the professions at universities weren't at all attracted by the army. This is something that meant that you needed to have significant private income. But on the outbreak of war, the officer training corps suddenly comes into its own. Lots of men who had served in it and had shown no real interest of going into the army units before the war do take commissions in the new armies, and it's thought that we're looking at over 50,000 men that take commissions through this route within the first few months of the war. But also the officer training corps units that survive at the universities carry on with training throughout the war, so that when the Rising breaks out on Easter Monday, you do actually have the OTC in being at Trinity College. Now, I've always wondered a little bit about who the men were that were in the OTC, because it's a small group, it turns out it's about 50, so they hear the shooting in what's now Connell Street when the GPO was seized. They act on what the head porter does at the Trinity College, and that he orders the gates of the college all to be closed, and these 50 students then get into the armoury, break out the rifles and take on the defence of the college. And I've always sort of wondered why they were there on Easter Monday, or were these the sort of, sad sacks of nowhere else to go, whose families didn't want them at home, who were desperately cramming to do exam resits for the umpteenth time. We do sort of wonder a little bit, but they take on the defence of Trinity College. And of course, in terms of Dublin itself, Trinity College sort of straddles the communications between the key rebel garrisons, so the fact that that's held and doesn't fall into rebel hands early on is rather important, so that's another sort of important aspect of it. They become reinforced by British Army troops proper from Easter Tuesday, and indeed a number of British soldiers and Australian soldiers who are on leave in Dublin when the Rising breaks out make their way to Trinity College and join the garrison there, so it becomes a very mixed group there. Another unit that finds itself caught up in the Rising is the Volunteer Training Corps, and the photograph I have here is of the Irish Rugby Football Union's Volunteer Corps on parade in Lansdowne Road Stadium, now the Viva Stadium as we must call it. And the man we're particularly talking about here is Frank Browning, who's here. Browning was the president of the Irish Rugby Football Union when the war broke out. Was a barrister by profession, was a former Ireland international rugby player himself, also very effective and keen cricketer. And Browning, on the outbreak of war, thought that the sports organisations, particularly the Rugby Football Union in the Dublin area, should organise volunteer corps. There were sort of genuine fears on the outbreak of war that there could be German raids and naval landings all around the coast of the British Isles, and this is something that Browning's very concerned about. So he sets up this volunteer corps in August 1914, and then when the 10th Irish Division is formed, one of the colonels, Colonel Downing of the 7th Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who's a keen rugby player, turns to his old friend Frank Browning to ask for his help in finding recruits for his unit. So this Irish Rugby Football Union group, which aren't all rugby players, it's more code for a middle class group, they enlist in large numbers in the D Company of the 7th Royal Dublin Fusiliers. Those that are young and fit enough to do so, and that's the group that you largely have on parade there. Those then go into the 7th Royal Dublin Fusiliers, which then is packed off to Gallipoli. They take fairly heavy losses at Gallipoli, as much through disease as through enemy action, and a large number of them end up getting commissioned. They're seen as being just the right type, being middle class, in many cases university graduates, to take on commissions. But what's left with Browning then are those who are too old for overseas service, or those whose business and commercial interests mean that they're tied to their jobs for the war. And this basically is reorganised then as a sort of dad's army organisation. In the First World War, it's the Volunteer Training Corps. Second World War, much more famously, we have the local defence volunteers, which become the Home Guard, but it's essentially the same sort of idea. And Browning is out with these men from the Irish Rugby Football Union Volunteer Corps and the other Volunteer Corps units from throughout Dublin, which number about 1,200 men in total. When the Rising breaks out, they were out in the Wicklow and Dublin Mountains carrying out training exercises over the essentially the bank holiday weekend. They then find out what's happening in Dublin and make their way back and decide that they must make their way to Beggars Bush Barracks to try and reinforce things there. It's the closest barracks to them as they come into the town. But at Beggars Bush Barracks they come under sniper fire. I'm not sure if I have Beggars Bush on the map here or not. Sorry. But it's basically down in the southeast of the city there. As they're coming in to reinforce that garrison in Beggars Bush barracks, they come under sniper fire in this area, Northumberland Road, and 4 men, including Browning, are killed in that. A number of them are badly wounded getting into the back of Beggars Bush barracks because they have to try and climb up over the wall where the gates have been closed, and being not the first flush of youth, that's very difficult for a lot of them. That then leads to a very lengthy toing and froing with the War Office, because the War Office tries to argue that these men were not combatants. When they were out on manoeuvres in the Dublin Mountains and so on, they weren't actually armed when they're shot. When they're trying to get into Beggars Bush barracks, they're also not properly armed, or if they have rifles, they don't have ammunition with them. So they're obviously viewed as combatants by the Irish Volunteers who open fire on them, but the British government argues for a period of about 3 months that they're not actually combatants, and tries to prevent paying out pensions to the families, which is a fairly grim element to it, as we might expect. The War Office run largely by the Treasury. I'll say a little bit, I'm conscious of about 5 to 10 minutes left. I'll say a little bit about what happens in terms of when the rising breaks out and how quickly these units react. Mike's already alluded to that idea of England's difficulty being Ireland's opportunity. And it looked as if that was going to play out very well from the point of view of how the British Army was organised in Dublin on Monday, 24th April 1916. Because L.B. Friend, the Major General, who was the General Officer commanding in Ireland, had decided to go off and leave over Easter. And it's not terribly clear that he made it clear to anyone else that he was going off and leave over Easter. So you would have expected that that would have led to some chaos. A number of officers had also disappeared on more or less official leave to look at the horse races at Ferryhouse. So there was a certain sense that things might be disorganised. The Colonel of the 3rd Royal Irish Rifles, Colonel McCammond, was on long-term sick leave, which also led to a problem of sorts for that unit. But, pardon me, Colonel Khan, who was a senior staff officer at Irish Command, heard about what was happening with the seizure of the GPO, with the attack on Dublin Castle shortly after noon. And he seems to have sat down in his office and telephoned through the news to anybody and everybody he could think of, alerting the battalions in Dublin itself, alerting those further afield, including in Belfast, and those out in the Curragh. And the Irish regiments, these reserve units, which as I've said, we would have thought would have been fairly poorly organised, a lot of raw recruits, a lot of men sent back from the front because they were deemed to be unfit for service medically. And for other reasons, these units actually swung into action pretty quickly. Pickets of 100 men of the 3rd Royal Irish Regiment and the 10th Royal Dublin Fusiliers were ready to move within 30 minutes of the message coming through from General Headquarters. And even in the 3rd Royal Irish Rifles, where things seemed to have been rather disorganised, they had a picket ready to move before 1 o'clock. So a lot of these units had acted fairly quickly.
Attention please, documents cannot be ordered after 4:15 p.m. It would be appreciated if documents no longer required are returned to the issue desk as soon as possible. Thank you for your cooperation.
One of the interesting characters in all this is Brigadier General William Hackett Payne, who, when the rising broke out, was in Belfast. He was in charge of the Ulster Reserve Brigade, which was there to raise recruits and train them and send them out to the Ulster Division. And Hackett Payne came to be sitting in an office in Belfast because when Major General Oliver Nugent took over command of the Ulster Division at the tail end of 1915, he thought that Hackett Payne was an old duffer, not up to it, and sent him home. But Hackett Payne, when he gets the warning through from Dublin, reacts very quickly, organises something called the Ulster Composite Battalion, which is made up of small groups of soldiers from about 12 different battalions that are in Ulster, and they're down in Dublin by the late afternoon of Easter Monday. So interesting, somebody who had been written off manages in the moment of crisis to react very well and very quickly and organises this composite unit. In terms of what these pickets try to do when the rising breaks out, The initial actions of the 3rd Royal Irish Rifles are an attempt to relieve Dublin Castle. They had been told that an attempt had been made to capture it, had been driven off almost single-handedly by Major Ivan Price, but they were conscious that that needed reinforcement. Dublin Castle, of course, the seat of British government in Ireland and a very important prize for the rebels. Major Latham then led 50 men from the Portobello barracks along Rathmines Road and towards Portobello Bridge. There they came under heavy fire from the Irish Citizens Army in Davies Pub. Latham ordered an attack against these snipers, showing that sort of First World War view of how you dealt with snipers, which was to launch a frontal attack against them. But he's wounded along with several of his men. Shortly after that, a Major Rigg from the same battalion arrives with reinforcements, organises another attack in Davies Pub, supported by a machine gun which they brought with them, and that was successful. So that group then moves towards the Jacob's Biscuit Factory and takes up a position around that, basically contains the Irish volunteer garrison in Jacob's Biscuit Factory from the early afternoon of Easter Monday. The 3rd Royal Irish Regiment moves from Richmond Barracks against the rebel positions in South Dublin Union. They're down on the left of our map here. And they surround that position, or almost surrounded. South Dublin Union is a massively sprawling complex, an old workhouse, and a very odd thing really for the rebels to have seized. It lumbered them with the necessity of looking after large numbers of paupers and hospital patients and so on. But the 3rd Royal Irish Regiment thought that they were making quite good progress there. They captured a few of the rebel outposts, but then on the afternoon of Easter Tuesday they were withdrawn from that area and ordered by Brigadier General Lowe, who was in temporary command in Dublin, to move to surround the General Post Office itself. And then it's the 3rd Royal Irish Regiment which are the ones that are involved in taking the surrender of the rebel garrison, and this is a photograph of their officers with the green flag there in the middle that had Irish Republic on it, which had flown over the General Post Office during most of the rising. So they played an absolutely crucial role in the end of the rising. From Easter Tuesday, men of the 59th Division were starting to disembark at Kingstown, now Dunleary, and on Wednesday, men of the Sherwood Foresters ran into very heavy fire down in Northumberland Road, down here at the bottom right of our map. They take very heavy casualties there, unsupported by artillery. They launch a frontal attack at about 5 o'clock on Easter Tuesday, and they take about 2.5 hours and over 230 casualties before they force the rebels in that position to retreat. But once they've got through that sniper screen, they're then able to reinforce British forces in the centre of Dublin. Another column coming from Kingston had taken an alternative route and took no casualties at all, which shows you some of the sort of chaos and failures of intelligence with them at all. But by late on Tuesday, then after Easter Monday, the British forces in Dublin are outnumbering the rebels by anything up to 10 to 1, depending on what sort of numbers you think came out on the rebel side. And on Friday, Major General Sir John Maxwell arrives to take command. He was a senior figure to replace a friend who had disappeared in the moment of crisis. I'll turn then to say a little bit about the British atrocities that are carried out, because it is one of the ironies, I suppose, of the rising, that it's Captain Bowen Coulter's murder of 4 unarmed civilians, which is often seen as the worst atrocity that's carried out by British troops, and it's carried out by an Irish soldier serving in an Irish regiment, Royal Irish Rifles. He killed the well-known Dublin pacifist Francis Shee Skeffington that Mark's already said a little bit about. And this became a cause célèbre. Bowen Coulthurst was court-martialed. He was convicted but sentenced to serve time in Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum rather than to go in front of the firing squad. The view was they'd been unhinged by his previous military service. And that becomes a real cause célèbre. He actually ends up his life as a bank manager out in Canada, so a very odd sort of end to the career. What Bowen Coulthurst had basically done was to taken Frank Shee Skeffington and 2 other men as hostages, and then went out with them on raiding parties. And it seems that with the Colonel McCammond, who was on sick leave, the major that was supposedly in command of the battalion didn't overrule this, took the view that, well, Bowen Coldhurst, as a serving regular officer, must know more about military law than he did, and this must be acceptable in this situation, and so on. But it seems that Bowen Coldhurst simply shot these men in cold blood in the middle of it all. The idea of them being used as hostages was just a pretense. There's evidence of other atrocities carried out by British forces. General Maxwell, talking about all this later on, said possibly some unfortunate incidents which we should regret now may have occurred. It is even possible that under the horrors of this attack, some of the troops saw red. That is an unfortunate consequence of rebellion of this kind. It was allowed to come into being among people and could not be suppressed by velvet glove methods. So an interesting view, and Maxwell there seems to particularly have been talking about some of the fighting in behind the General Post Office when it sort of got into the sort of tenement slum areas there, where it seems that some civilians were killed and then buried in the sort of basements of their buildings, which are just loose earth. Obviously the British Army is then very much involved in the executions that follow the Rising. 15 executions carried out in Dublin, and some very odd aspects to that. That the men are tried by Field General Court Martial, which was meant to be held under martial law outside the UK as an oddity. That these trials are held in secret and camera, as the phrase goes, is also very odd. And even at the time, some of the government law officers were saying, well, the Rising has been suppressed, so why are these men not being tried by the civilian courts? And of course the way in which this all comes out with a drip effect, a few executions here, 3 there, means that this looks very, very bad, and people in Dublin and Ireland more generally just aren't clear when the idea when it's meant to stop. Ultimately we get the 15 executions, 73 others were sentenced to death, but had those sentences commuted to prison sentences. But then, of course, as a reaction against that, or as part of that, we also get the mass internment of 3,000 suspects. There is the cry round up the usual suspects that goes out throughout Ireland, and it's said that this is one of the ways in which the British Army really mishandles the Rising, that all sorts of men and women who weren't particularly radical were then swept in this internment exercise, a number of them packed off to Fearghal, which had been a prisoner of war camp, then an internment camp in North Wales, and Michael Collins and others talk about that as the University of the Revolution. This is where they worked out how guerrilla warfare would work, what a sort of Sinn Féin action strategy and so on could look like in the future. The final thing I'll say very briefly is that there is a reaction to this from Irish units on the Western Front, as we might expect, if we think about the sort of British Army more widely. And as we'd expect, a battalion in the Ulster Division doesn't really show much concern about the fate of rebels who were executed after the Rising. This is from the 14th Royal Irish Rifles, Trench Journal, The Incinerator. Speaking for ourselves, we'd rather have seen a little less mercy to some of the rebels. If a man out here plays any old tricks, he is given short shrift, shot at daybreak. Remember, this man may have fought long and sturdily for his empire, but still he'd be shot. Then what kind of death do those insurgent dogs deserve? Those swine who seize upon the fact that the soldier is away, fighting and dying to save Sinn Féiner worthless skins, to rifle and rat and murder a whole lot of innocent people. Doesn't it make your blood boil, lads? What we might expect is a unionist reaction. We also have some elements of sort of constitutional nationalist views, or the views of the volunteers who had followed Redmond's call to go into the British Army. The 7th Leinster Regiment, for example, captures placards that the Germans had put up in the trenches across from them, which read, "Irishmen, great uproar in Ireland, English guns are firing on your wives and children." We got a few other examples of trench raids to sort of show that these Irish units weren't particularly disheartened. And the 9th Munster Fusiliers supposedly hangs up an effigy of Sir Roger Casement in no man's land to show that they had little respect for his views. So my sort of concluding thoughts, I suppose, is this is perhaps another example of what we often hear about as unknown soldiers, thinking of sort of Irish soldiers that are involved in putting down the Rising. That then gives us the element of a civil war involved in this, not just sort of English soldiers versus Irish rebels. And perhaps a foretaste of what Fearghal's going to tell us, is that the accounts by Irish soldiers of all this British soldiers in Dublin are relatively few and far between. There's been a recent publication on these, which is based very much on the holdings of the Imperial War Museum, but they're very sparse compared to the massive Bureau of Military History Witness Statement project that was carried out in the 1940s and 50s for those that were on the rebel side in the Rising. I'll end it there then, thank you.
A really broad topic, which is outcomes of the Easter Rising, and really where do we draw the line there? Because I mean, some people would see what's happening this year, 2016, as a kind of an important moment in the ever-changing self-definition of Irish identity and the identity of the southern state. So really you could say we're still living with the outcomes of the Easter Rising. I think that's no exaggeration. But in this talk I want to focus primarily on military, social and economic, political and ideological outcomes. I'll say a little bit about commemoration also. But before thinking about evaluation, before thinking about outcomes, it's worth thinking a little bit about expectations. I think we need to think about what the rebels wanted to achieve before we can come to any kind of conclusions as to how successful they were. And I would differ a little bit in emphasis from Mike in terms of the thinking behind at least some of those involved in the military council. It's certainly true that there was a range of expectations, I think, amongst the individuals involved. And it's also true, as Mike brings out, of course, that the rebellion that took place on the Monday is much smaller than the rebellion which had been initially conceived for the Sunday. But at the same time, I think that by and large most of the leaders didn't have too many illusions about what was possible, even if things had gone along the lines that they'd hoped for on the Sunday rather than the Monday. And one reason I can argue that is if you think about the tactics themselves that the rebel leaders utilised on Easter week. They went into 5 or 6 big buildings, fortified them, and waited for the British Army to come with machine guns, artillery, and so on. And I think one of the reasons why there wasn't a bigger rising, it's not just because of the Ord and Roger Casement and the counterman, but it's also because a lot of Republicans around the country, in the Irish Volunteers, but also in the IRB, thought that the military plans made no sense, and that the military strategy didn't add up. And of course, this is central to Owen McNeill's view. He believes not only is there any military possibility of success, but he also believes it's immoral if you're killing people for something that doesn't have a military chance of success. So I would more emphasise the Rising as a kind of propaganda of the deed. You know, it's not an original idea. Many people have argued for this. It's a kind of carefully planned spectacle. It's parallels with modern day acts of terrorism, I suppose. It's a shocking event that's meant to really transform public opinion and transform the political context also. So I think the rebel leaders by and large had quite similar motives. You know, they all agreed, I think, that action, even if that action was unlikely to be effective or to be militarily effective, that action could change a very unwelcome present that they lived in. I think a lot of them were frustrated, despondent, disillusioned about the state of public opinion, relative popularity, their war effort, marginalisation of republicanism and so on. But at the same time, I think there were some differences that are a little bit difficult to discern because the language used by the different leaders was quite similar. So I think Patrick Pearse was wedded to what would seem to us now, the 21st century, very bizarre, kind of mystical notion of blood sacrifice, redemption. Like Christ dying to save his people, Pearse doing the same thing to redeem the nation. Whereas I think if you look at, as Mike brings out, McDermott and Clark, you've got a much more hard-headed revolutionary kind of tradition, and they'll also talk about sacrifice and being willing to die, but in a much more rational kind of sense. Well, there's no point being a revolution if you're not willing to fight and die, even if the odds are against you. Having said that, Tim mentioned the Bureau of Military History's witness statements. If you look at the rank and file, quite a few of them assumed that they had some chance of success. And of course, as Mike's talk brings out, they weren't told what was happening. They weren't consulted in any way, and a lot of them trusted that if their officers were bringing them out to fight, that there was some kind of military point to it, that they weren't being brought out to be, as Tom Clark told some of them in the GPO, to be wiped out. You know? So that's an interesting kind of tension, I think. So the Rising is very much, it's an elitist event, and Mike brings that out very much out in terms of the planning. It's complete secrecy. So I think that's important. Before we think of outcomes, it's important what do they expect to happen. And a common unionist critique, which is still here to this day, of the Rising is that it was a pathetic military failure that achieved little other than death and destruction. And I think there's a much stronger case that the Rising largely achieved what the Military Council wanted it to achieve. It transformed the political context in Ireland. It destroyed the credibility of the Irish Party, and the Home Rule project died with the Easter Rebellion. It exposed what Republicans would have seen as the coercive, violent realities that underpinned British rule in Ireland. You know, they didn't believe British rule was based on democracy. So they felt that what they were doing in Easter would expose the brutal military nature of the relationship between the two countries. And of course then it won popular support for republicanism. So I think if you go down that checklist, most of the military council would be pretty happy with what they achieved. And in fact we know from the witness statements that as some of them prepared to die the days before the executions, they were happy. They felt they'd done enough to change everything. Michael Collins was quite dismissive in comparing the Rising to a Greek tragedy, and he would of course go on to pioneer a very different kind of violence. Michael Collins wasn't much into self-sacrifice, you know, he's more into different kind of fighting. But I think what Collins seems to have missed is that the rebels' tactics at Easter were ideally suited to achieve the symbolic objective that the organisers had in mind. Pierce wrote about a bloody protest for a glorious thing, and that's an interesting formula, a bloody protest, you know, that notion of self-sacrifice again. And if you look at how the rebels fight, it seems to me that very often they're kind of a weird mirror image. They're not revolutionaries, they're a weird mirror image of the British Army that Tim's been talking about. They occupy fixed points by and large. They wear uniforms. They have an officers' mess, as Margaret mentioned. They all have fancy titles, lots of generals, Connolly's a general, there's lots of other generals knocking around. And all of this, I think, is from a propaganda point of view. I mean, it reflects where they are, I think, psychologically and morally, but from a propaganda point of view, it's very effective in kind of adding moral weight to what happens at Easter week, in a way which the kind of violence that Collins was effective at wouldn't have. You know, there's nothing heroic about shooting a policeman in the back of the head as he's leading mass on a Sunday or whatever. But whereas what you're seeing on the Easter weekend is this kind of almost like a reenactment of the violence of the First World War by a group of people who feel that they're a conventional army fighting for their nation in the same way as other young men are across in the Somme and so on. So that's just in terms of maybe thinking a little bit about what the mindset of the rebels. So in terms of the outcomes, I'm just going to say a little bit about the immediate outcomes, the short-term outcomes through 1916, the medium-term outcomes in terms of the revolutionary period, and then I'll just say a little bit about the legacy. And that's basically the structure. So in terms of the... Let's look for my pointy arrow. Not in the usual place there on laptops. That's it, okay, so that's... Okay, good. So in terms of the immediate outcomes, I think it's quite important to begin with the first obvious outcome, which is death. Around 500 people were killed, and around 2,600 were wounded. Michael was talking about Tom Clark's ruthlessness, and if you look at this breakdown of casualties here, I think you either have an example of Clark's ruthlessness or else a kind of a thoughtlessness. You know, the fact that the biggest group of people who were killed were civilians. If you think about it, it was kind of obvious that was going to happen if you're going to have a rebellion against the British Army and located in the centre of a city in a built-up area surrounded by slums. And as you can see, the majority of the casualties are civilians, which is, I think, important to note, particularly because that was largely overlooked for most of the past 100 years. When people thought about the Rising, they thought about the 16 men executed, rather than the people who didn't willingly die for Ireland. And it's interesting that that's really changing in 2016. I mean, the book that's been most successful this year, as many people will know, is Joe Duffy's book about the children of the revolution. So I think that's a really interesting cultural moment, why there is an appetite and a willingness to think about that dimension of the Rising. It's very revealing about the way there's a kind of a willingness to have a more kind of complex approach to the Easter Rising 100 years on. And of course, this majority of people, they're all individuals with their own really interesting stories. And again, the fact that one of the civilian victims is on a stamp shows, I think, how there's a real change attitude from the state, from the Irish state, as well as from public opinion about who we remember and how we remember them. This is Sean Foster. He was 2, and he was one of the youngest of the victims, civilian victims. And he was shot in his pram outside the father. And he's got a quite interesting kind of family story as well, because his father had been killed fighting in the First World War the year before. And his uncle is fighting during Easter week. He's a rebel manning a barricade. So I think when you look at individuals and individual families, you can see the terms have been used already. A civil war. There's a kind of civil war. There's a lot of divided identities even within individual families, which I think is interesting and important to note. And interestingly, Sean's mother blamed both the rebels and the British Army. She's quite, I think, a little bit bitter, unsurprisingly, about what happened. She blamed the rebels for her son's death. She blamed the British for her husband's death. Also, we were just briefly mentioning that the number of Crown forces is quite higher than the rebels, and of course the rebels are inside the buildings, whereas the Crown forces are outside, so they're more vulnerable, particularly in situations like Mount Street, as we mentioned. And then the rebels, a relatively kind of small number of the fatalities because of where they are. So that's death. Destruction is the other obvious immediate impact of Easter week. And this is a fire insurance map, and I quite like it because you can see really clearly how much of the city centre was destroyed and how extensive those kind of areas were. I believe that business owners claimed for about 2.5 million back then, which God knows what that would be now. Although some people say they padded the claims, so it was a good opportunity to, you win the biggest claim you can, but that's human nature. But certainly you can see the extent of the destruction is very significant. And maybe it gives you also a sense of how severe the destruction was, that important buildings like the GPO weren't actually rebuilt until 1929. Of course, there was Civil War violence as well, but still it shows you just to what extent it destroyed much of the very city centre. So death, destruction, you can see again there just how bad the damage was. And then the suppression of the Rising itself. 15 men dead, executed between the 3rd and 12th of May, as we've heard. About 3,000 maybe arrested, including 79 women, which I think is probably more than actually participated in the Easter Rising, which is revealing in itself about the intelligence and what else is going on at that point. About 2,000 of those arrested, including I think 5 women, are interned in Britain, and mostly ending up in Fearghal, where they get busy organising for the next round. Martial law is declared, and I think what's really significant is that the civilian political administration gets replaced by General Maxwell, and that kind of symbolises the dynamic that shapes a lot of what follows over the next weeks and months, which is basically political logic is no longer important. It's about military logic. It's about doing what you need to do in terms of the wider context of the First World War, securing Ireland, and it doesn't really matter to what extent you alienate nationalist opinion. The military rationale becomes all important. And as we know, and as Tim was mentioning, the principal catalyst for the change of opinion that begins to happen very, very quickly is the executions and the imprisonment. And in fact, the first evidence we have of popular support for Republicans, and as we know, some of the rebels were spat out and attacked by ordinary Dubliners, by some ordinary Dubliners during Easter week. The first indication we had that popular opinion is changing is when people start donating money to the prisoner support organisations, in which women played a very important role. So it's true sympathy for the prisoners and for the executed that people begin to sort of articulate a kind of a sense of support for republicanism. So you could argue actually that the rebels are much more popular as victims of British injustice than as revolutionaries killing people during Easter week. And then we've heard also from Tim about the revelations of atrocities. This is drip in the weeks that follows, particularly the killing of innocent civilians at North King Street. Further suppression continues into the spring. Nationwide arrests, including in areas which hadn't risen, continue into May. Roger Casement is hanged in August, and so on. And of course, all of this is against a period of military rule. There is a kind of debate about whether all this should be seen as a terrible mistake or a blunder by Britain, and I think you've got to bear in mind the political realities here. There was no way that Britain were not going to execute the leaders. This was the least that was demanded by British public opinion, and if you look at the numbers that they execute, it's pretty small really, considering the scale of the rising. But it was sufficient to have that kind of impact on public opinion that changed everything. And also, as I think Tim was talking about earlier, the manner of the killings is probably more important than the number. It's drip, groups of 2 and 3 over a period of 2 weeks, public opinion beginning to build in terms of outrage. One witness talks about blood seeping from underneath a locked door, this sense of people being killed secretly. There's a sense of injustice, the unnecessary use of the field general courts-martial. But there's also a sense that, going back to the way they'd fought, that they'd fought bravely, openly, they'd worn uniforms. Why weren't they then treated like prisoners of war are treated in France? So nationalists feel there's a kind of all sorts of double standards, and they felt that all the way, going back to how the UVF is treated and the Bachelor's Walk shootings and so on. So that feeds into a kind of a narrative. So that's the immediate outcome.
Attention please. The search room and reading room will close in 15 minutes. Please finish off your research for today. Thank you.
So let's just look very briefly at short-term outcomes. I mentioned the transformation of public opinion. We see the popularity of the rebels beginning to build. Within a month or two, the Inspector General police reports are saying that the rebels have got public support in the towns, and then subsequently nationwide. And then a sort of a public support or public sympathy for the rebels begins to sort of merge into something which is, I think, distinct, which is a public support for the objectives of the rebels, for their political objectives, separatism, republicanism, maybe the use of violence even to win freedom. So everything has changed within a few months in terms of the political and public climate. If we move on to medium-term outcomes, just thinking about the wider revolutionary period, I think what we can say is that the rising either begins or it very much hastens the process by which the Irish Party and Home Rule no longer represented the outlook of most Irish nationalists. But I think it's important to put this in terms of the wider context of the First World War. So Redmond is kind of on the skids from the moment that he backs the British war effort and suggests that Irish men should enlist. From that moment, I think you can begin to see the popularity of the Irish Party declining. And other than the rising, the single biggest incident which destroys the credibility of the Irish Party and builds the popularity of Republicans is, of course, the 1918 conscription crisis. So it's the rising, but it's also the rising within that wider First World War context. And of course, there wouldn't have been a rising without that war. It was always all about the war, even in terms of the thinking of the rebel leaders. It was a war that was possible. And so we can measure this change of political opinion very easily through all sorts of milestones. Like in 1917, the Irish Party began losing by-elections, and people began voting for people who were sympathetic to the Republicans, like Count Plunkett, father of Joseph Plunkett, and then they began voting for actual Republicans themselves, Joe McGuinness, imprisoned in Britain, and then they start voting actually for Republicans. And Sinn Féin and the Irish Volunteers emerge as explicitly Republican organisations in 1917. And the tide has really turned everywhere, except curiously parts of Ulster, where a lot of nationalists are still loyal to the Irish Party. So the medium-term political and ideological outcomes are various. It's not just that the Irish Party is replaced by Sinn Féin, but the idea of sort of constitutional nationalism, a kind of compromise, a moderate nationalist politics, is replaced by republicanism, by separatism, even by support for physical force methods to win freedom. So I think that's quite a significant political change. Another important outcome of the Easter Rising is the emergence of republicanism specifically as the dominant ideology that Irish nationalists share. So if you look at before the Easter Rising, Republicans are just one group of several different radical groupings that oppose the Irish Party. You know, you've got Sinn Féin, the dual monarchists, you've got all these other groupings. But it's the Rising specifically that makes republicanism the thing that everyone can unite around. I don't think they have a very sophisticated sense of what republicanism means. For some it might be just a tricolour, the sacrifice of the men at Easter week, but that's the agreed agenda that everybody can kind of row behind. So I think that's an important outcome. And we see that in terms of Sinn Féin becoming a Republican Party in 1917 and the November 1918 general election, when Irish or nationalist public opinion endorses the idea of the Republic, and then of course January 1919 the establishment of the Dáil, which is essentially establishing the Republic which had been proclaimed by Pearse in Easter 1916. So I think the Republican leaders would have felt job well done, pretty happy with the outcome. Probably, I suspect, would have been surprised at how quickly public opinion changed. Some of them talk about, in 10 or 20 years the people will be behind us. I think they would have been surprised if it was 17 or 18 months and everything had changed. Many people have changed their views. Moving on then, in terms of medium-term outcomes, the impact in Ulster is interesting. The partition, I think, was inevitable by 1914. The politicians were gathered in Buckingham Palace, arguing over the map. Where does the line go through Tyrone? You know, it was just about the detail. The principle of partition, I think, was pretty much conceded all around. But I think you can say that certainly the establishment of a Northern Ireland state was something that would have seemed very unlikely before the Easter Rising. The outcome that people expected was home rule and partition, with the North remaining part of the British state largely as it existed, and you would have had Dublin Castle continuing in some form, perhaps maybe up in Belfast, and of course home rule would have meant that there was really strong links between the 26 county home rule state, or state, as we just about call it that, and the rest of the UK. So this suggests that, weirdly enough, one of the biggest group of political beneficiaries of the Easter Rising were Ulster's Unionists. And maybe the next time Ulster Unionist politicians are all reluctant about participating in the commemoration of the Easter Rising, they could perhaps reflect on that weird irony. So there's a lot of unintended consequences from this decade of war and revolution. So just moving on then to ideological legacies. So the most important impact of 1916 in terms of political ideas, I think, is how it reshapes attitudes within Irish nationalism. The Easter Rising kind of revives the use of political violence, and I think if you look at the accounts pre-1916, you do get a strong sense that the physical force tradition, the revolutionary tradition, whatever you want to call it, is seen as something that belongs to the past. It's kind of quaint. it's 1798, 1848. It's not something that seems a realistic method to many Irish nationalists. I think that's one of the reasons why you have all these ballads and poems and plays, because it just seems a safe part of the past. But what the rebels do in 1916, I think, is hugely powerful, which is that, and if you obviously, when you look at the proclamation, this is absolutely central to it. They establish, they write themselves into that history, into that revolutionary history, and they make 1916, someone described it, one of the magic numbers, so that you can say 1798, 1803, 1848, 1867, and 1916. They actually managed to revive that tradition of ceaseless resistance to British rule. And they make it a reality, because it would have seemed a kind of an old-fashioned idea to a lot of people, I think, before. And these people, the Yeats poem, I think, says it best. These people were mocked and ridiculed before they did what they did. So the Rising brings the revolutionary tradition from the margins of Irish politics to the very centre, and it establishes the idea of a republic as the sort of the agreed way forward amongst nationalists. So it provides a kind of a model, a justification and a legitimacy for Republicans in 1916, but also 1917, going forward, particularly for Republicans who want to use physical force aims, physical force methods to achieve their political aims. So I think, speaking here in Belfast, it's hardly necessary to point out that this is a problematic legacy in certain respects. I think the Rising certainly contributes greatly to the War of Independence, because as soon as Sinn Féin established the Dáil in 1919 and saying we will accept nothing less than a republic, as soon as they do that, I think violence is inevitable, because Britain won't and can't concede a republic. So as soon as you sort of make that your objective, then violence is almost certainly inevitable. And I think one of the people who had a clearer sense of this is Arthur Griffith, who's a really underrated figure. He objected to Sinn Féin making the republic their objective, because he said, well, the British aren't going to give you a republic, so what are you going to do when it comes time to make a compromise settlement? So what that suggests is 1916 not just brings about the War of Independence, but it brings about the Civil War, because many Republicans are not willing to cast aside the republic, particularly after they've fought and died for it from 1919 to 1921. So certainly the Rising is really problematic, and it really makes much more likely that there will be a violent conflict with Britain. But I think also it's quite likely that violence will come anyway, because if you draw back from Ireland and look at what happens around the rest of Europe in the post First World War period, Ireland is really part of a much wider pattern of new nation states emerging and winning their freedom, often through violent methods, from the collapsing or declining imperial power. So it really is part of a broader pattern. And you could also envisage a scenario where, had there not been a Rising, that maybe the conscription crisis could have led to a different kind of conflict, maybe the kind of guerrilla warfare that emerges in 1919. So the Rising shapes how it happens, but that's not to say that it wouldn't have happened otherwise in some way. Getting closer to the end chronologically, so bear with me. In the longer term, the legacy of the Easter Rising, so I think it's obviously directly connected to the War of Independence and the Civil War, but it has some impact on the Troubles, I think also. The 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising in 1966 didn't cause the Troubles. Some people claim it did, but most historians would disagree with that. But 1966, the commemorations provided a kind of a lightning rod for the tensions within Northern Irish society that existed at that time. And a lot of people who talk about 1966 focus on the Troubles in 1969, but it's really interesting where the violence does occur in 1966. It occurs on the Loyalist side, in the group which probably make best use of the potential of the commemorations to stir the pot is Ian Paisley. And you also have the re-emergence of the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1966. And the first killings that take place in 66 are killings by Loyalists of Catholics. So it's not that Republicans are also using 1966 to rebuild support. But I think by and large what's happening is that the anniversaries are reflecting the fact that Northern Ireland is a society that's very much ill at ease, and that the tensions emerging from, in particular, Terence O'Neill's failure to sort of reform society, that they're one of the outlets through which those tensions become evident. But what does happen, of course, during the Troubles is that the Provisional IRA can stake a very credible claim to the legacy of the Rising. And, I have a picture here. We'll go backwards in a little bit. So you can see that idea of rooting the legitimacy of the Troubles to a certain extent in what happens in 1916. But I think if you look at the accounts of kind of people who joined the IRA in the 1970s and so on, most of them are pretty dismissive of the idea that 1916 is really an important part of their thinking. I think the impact of 1916 and the Troubles is much more in terms of propaganda than any kind of causation. And the romantic idea of rebellion plays a much more minor role, I think, in politicisation than the realities, the day-to-day realities of life for the minority in Northern Ireland. But there is another kind of outcome of how the Rising becomes part of the Troubles discourse, which is, of course, the more the IRA can lay claim to the legacy of the Easter Rising, the lower the stock of the Easter Rising falls in Southern Ireland. And by the time you get to 1991, the 75th anniversary of the Easter Rising, I mean, there's really a significant embarrassment in the Southern state around celebrating or commemorating the rebellion. And it's not until 2006 when interestingly the military parade, which had been stopped in the early 1970s when the Trouble breaks out, is restored to O'Connell Street, that you see again a sense that Irish people in the South are comfortable about remembering the Easter Rising in a kind of unabashed sort of way. In other ideological respects, though, I think the legacy of 1916 was less significant. I think a lot of people in Ireland after 1916, a lot of Republicans tended to define the Republic in a very narrow sense, meaning a Republican state, or for some of them actually just meaning a separate state, a state with no connections to Britain, which is separatism really rather than republicanism. And I think what was lost very often was that the ambitions of many of those who took part in the Easter Rising was not just a separate independent state, but it was actually to transform Irish society. And of course, we go back to the proclamation, you can see some of those radical ideals very clearly. And I think one of the areas where the Rising doesn't have an impact, which is worth thinking about, is in terms of its ideological influence on shaping Irish politics and Irish society. The radicalism of the proclamation doesn't really feed through in a significant way.
The Public Record Office is now closed. Please ensure all documents have been returned to the issue desk.
So, if you look at the democratic programme which was passed, for example, in 1919, a lot of the language of the proclamation is there. But if you look at how the TDs who are elected, they don't really necessarily take it seriously. Kevin O'Higgins says it's just poetry. And the state that emerges from the revolution is a very socially conservative state. It doesn't seem to be shaped very much by the radical ideals of people like James Connolly, and even the different kinds of radical ideas of Patrick Pearse in terms of cultural ideas in certain respects. So I think we can identify a variety of losers from the revolutionary period, as well as those who gained. Southern Protestants, obviously, Northern Catholics, but also maybe kind of liberal and radical impulses in society. Two largely socially conservative states emerge from the Irish Revolution, and neither of those states shows much commitment to the rights of minorities, as don't most interwar states in Europe. Democracy is a kind of a majoritarian game. But I think it's particularly interesting to think about some of those groups who lose out, who actually took part in the Easter Rising, but can be seen to sort of lose out in terms of the consequences. of the revolution. And we've already heard about one important group, which is women and feminists in particular, but also socialists could consider themselves to be kind of pretty poorly served by the outcome of the revolution, that they do quite a lot to bring about. It was probably inevitable that the state that emerged reflected the socially conservative values of the society in which it occurred. I mean, revolutionaries, by virtue of being revolutionary, are always ahead of the curve. I mean, that's inevitable. But I think what's striking is how a very conservative Irish Free State legitimised itself in the 20s and 30s by claiming the legacy of this very revolutionary moment in Irish history. And you can have some pictures here which sort of shows how that was done. I think one way in which you make this very revolutionary moment a more conservative moment is by framing it in an explicitly Catholic perspective. And of course the writings of Patrick Pearse are very useful here, because you've got, you know, all sorts of ideas, Easter, martyrdom and so on, which make it very easy to do that. And so I think religion is really important, and I think one of the reasons why in 2016 we're looking at the Rising so differently is because we sort of, particularly in the South, it's kind of a post-Catholic era in many respects. So I think religion is really important. If you look at, for example, what happens to people like Roger Casement, you know, converts to Catholicism before his death. Markovich converts to Catholicism. And then if you look at how the Rising is projected by propagandists in the weeks and months after, you have very much an idea of the Rising as a Catholic event. And even some of the leaders of the Rising, who were more secular-minded before they go to their death, embraced the idea of Catholicism, maybe genuinely, but I think more as a kind of propagandistic idea. They know that it will make their sacrifice much more powerful, and it will be a kind of uniting kind of force and help to win popular support by emphasising Catholicism as one of the things which is influencing them. And if you look at the propaganda that emerges almost immediately afterwards, the Catholic Bulletin is one of the really influential magazines which reports the Easter Rising, because of course all the Republican magazines are censored. And the Catholic Bulletin reported the death of Sean Connolly, who was a socialist and a member of the Citizen Army, without mentioning that he was a socialist or a member of the Citizen Army. They just mentioned that he was in the Catholic Sodality. You know? So these guys who were revolutionaries become, you know, Catholic martyrs, and that's how they're being remembered almost immediately. Bill McCormick has a nice expression when he talks about how the hierarchy can hold their nose and baptise the Fenians. You know, so if you think about it, the two groups that bring about the Easter Rising, you've got the socialists, disliked by the church, and you've got Fenians, who are really disliked by historically disliked by the church. They kind of get remembered as Catholic nationalists, and that helps to kind of make things okay in certain respects. And of course, a lot of people who flocked to the IRA after 1916 are also very religious, as were many of the rebels. So, final point I really want to make in terms of outcomes is just thinking a little about some of the other people who maybe don't do so well, who took part in the Easter Rising. There is an idea that if you were in the GPO, you did well at the Easter Rising, and you know, we tend to think of people like Eamon de Valera, but I think in some ways that's quite misleading. I think a small political elite did very well at the Easter Rising, and over the next half century, this fairly small group of people would rule unbroken. I mean, 1916 leaders remained in power right up until the 1960s, and they very effectively used their involvement in the Easter Rising to legitimise their political power. And I think we have a kind of picture here of de Valera. You know, Easter commemorations they were commemorating 1916, but they're also commemorating de Valera as the last living commandant, and he got a lot of political capital out of that. But one of the new sources we have that's telling us a lot about the revolution in just in the last year or so is the military service pensions. And we have about 80,000 people, I think, applied for military service pensions, and about 15,000 people received them. So we have this huge kind of database which tells us not just what people did during 1916 and the revolution, but also, really interestingly, tells us about their lives afterwards. And most of them had lives of poverty and hardship. So I've written a book. Everybody else has put their book on the hardware, so I will too. And it's a book about 7 people who were connected with the Abbey Theatre, who took part in the Easter Rising. 6 of them lived. Sean Connolly was the one who died. 6 of them lived, and of the 6, 5 of them suffered real poverty and kind of hardship in their lives afterwards. So there were a lot of in social and material terms. There were a lot of people who lost out afterwards. And the other thing which I explore in this book is that there's a lot of tensions between how the Easter Rising is commemorated by the state and by people like De Valera, seen as a kind of successful kind of event which legitimises their political rule, and the individuals who took part in the Rising. And out of my 6 individuals who lived, all of them expressed in different ways frustration and resentment about what happened in the decades after. They didn't regret their role in Easter Rising, but they regretted the nature of the state that emerged. And a really good example of this, who we've heard about from Margaret earlier, is Helena Maloney. And Helena Maloney is very explicit in saying in the 1920s and 1930s that, well, we fought for egalitarianism, proclamations about equality. Instead, we get a state in which women are treated as second class, people are not recognised as citizens. So the final point I just want to make then, really, in terms of summing up, is that I think what makes the Easter Rising fascinating is that we're always changing our views on it, because it's an iconic event. So it's one of those events that as society changes, we look back and take different things from it. So from the 20s to the 50s, we had a very Catholic understanding of the Rising. Patrick Pearse was almost like a saint-like figure. Whereas now in 2016, there's a huge, as Margaret was mentioning earlier, there's a real rediscovery of what I call, the subtitle of my book, The Lost Revolution. The Lost Revolution, so feminism and socialism and more radical kind of ideals that at least some of those involved had. And this idea of the Rising always changing, you can see in the idea of how images are recycled again and again. So this stamp is from 1941, when the 25th anniversary is being commemorated during the emergency. And the state's message here, I think, is very clear. Ireland is prepared to defend itself from foreign invasion. But then you see the same image being recycled during the Troubles in a completely different context. Beachmount Avenue with RPG Avenue written just a little bit underneath it. And another kind of last example of this idea of recycling, Cuchullin's, the famous Oliver Shepherd statue, which was De Valera placed in the GPO, features, kind of predictably in Republican murals during the Troubles, but it also features in Loyalist murals, which is really interesting, I think. I think what this suggests is that we will continue to have new histories of the Easter Rising as we find different aspects of that past which speaks to us. Example there of the rediscovery of the women is really striking. A lot of these women were very little known, even though people like Margaret had been writing about them for 20 or 30 years. They hadn't really, I think it's fair to say, entered the public consciousness until quite recently. Whereas now you can find yourself in Dublin and a bus will pass by you with Helena Maloney or whoever, and people know who they are. So I think I'll leave that.